Please note that your video and audio have been disabled. So if you have any questions, please use the Q&A box, which can be found at the bottom of your Zoom window. You can add questions for our speakers anytime during the webinar there. Please use the Q&A box for your questions rather than the chat box. Please note that the webinar is being recorded. Lauren, if you can start the recording for us, that would be great. The recording for this webinar, along with the presentation slides, will be available on the INEE website following the webinar completion. Registrants for the webinar will also receive an email after the webinar with a link to the recording and the presentation slides. This webinar is also being closed captioned. So at the bottom of your Zoom window, you'll see an option to turn on the closed captioning, which is available in English. My name is Margie Bott. I am the Education Policy Coordinator at INEE, the Interagency Network for Education in Emergencies. Many of you are already members, but if you are not, I encourage you to visit inee.org and click on the top right side of your screen and become a member. INEE is an open global network of members working together with a humanitarian and development framework to ensure that all individuals have the right to quality, safe, relevant, and equitable education. We are made up of more than 16,000 individual members and 130 partner organizations across 190 countries. Our members are NGO and UN personnel, Ministry of Education and other government staff, students, teachers, donors, and researchers who work closely and collectively to achieve our shared goal of increasing access to quality education opportunities in education in emergency contexts. It's INEE's alternative education workstream within the Education Policy Working Group is very excited to bring you this webinar and to share the work of our friends from the Accelerated Education Working Group on the latest evidence on accelerated education. To get us started, it's my pleasure to introduce you to Lisa Bender. Ms. Bender is an expert on education in crisis-affected contexts and is currently with UNICEF's global headquarters, where she provides technical and policy advice. Ms. Bender serves in a number of global leadership and advisory capacities, most recently as lead author of the IASC guidance on COVID-19 prevention and control in schools and other multi-agency frameworks for reopening schools. Lisa, I'll hand it off to you now. Thank you.
Hi, Margie. Thank you so much. First, I want to just really extend my appreciation to INEE for working with us and collaborating with us on this webinar, and a special thank you to Margie, who's always a real pleasure to work with. Everyone, welcome. We are looking forward to the discussion. We've been looking forward to it for some time. You know, we are all called in this work to really think about how we serve the most marginalized and to ask ourselves tough questions about what works and who it works for, and to understand systemic barriers and institutional barriers where they exist. And that's one of the reasons that I'm really excited about the Accelerated Education Working Group. It's one of my favorite groups, everyone knows, and very excited to speak with you all about this work. So again, welcome. We're really looking forward to a rich discussion. We've got an exciting panel here to share information with you and discuss the how this work can be applied in all of our portfolios. So I'm going to turn my video off and so that we can focus on the slides and I can give you a good introduction of those who will be speaking with us. So we can move to the next slide, please. Okay, so our featured presenter is Dr. Ritesh Shah. He is a widely recognized expert in the field of education and conflict and emergencies. He's a senior lecturer at the University of Auckland's Faculty of Education and Social Work, and he has produced a number of publications that have been used by practitioners around the world, as well as well-respected academic pieces. And one of the reasons we love working with Dr. Shah is because he finds that mix of operational, practical work along with rigorous academic efforts. We're also happy to have with us Pete Sims, who's a senior advisor at Plan International in Canada. Mr. Sims has a rich history working as a teacher and a teacher trainer, has advised ministries of education, UN agencies, and INGOs. He's also specializing in fragile and conflict-affected settings. And today he's representing the INEE Alternative Education Workstream. I'll be talking about some of the complementarities between these two areas of work. We have Martha Hewison, who is our beloved coordinator for the Accelerated Education Working Group. She's an education advisor with UNHCR. Prior to her current role, Martha's worked for over 20 years in the education sector for many international organizations, donor agencies, and governments, and has, again, dedicated her work to education in conflict and post-conflict contexts. And we're also very fortunate to have Kayla Boswart with us. She's an independent researcher and evaluator who's been working in non-formal and accelerated education for out-of-school children and youth in emergency contexts. She's also made incalculable contributions to the Accelerated Education Working Group in a number of technical and advisory roles. And so we're really happy that she can be here with us to help moderate some of the rich discussion that is coming up. So we'll move to the next slide, please. Okay, so let me just give you a little information about the Accelerated Education Working Group. It's coordinated by UNHCR, but has had active participation from over 10 agencies, which include, of course, UNICEF, my organization, UNESCO, USAID, NRC, IRC, Save the Children, Plan International, the Education Development Center, and War Child Holland. The AEWG was convened in 2015, so we've had 5 years of getting some really substantial work done. This was a moment for partners to come together and say that accelerated education has a lot of potential, but it looks very different from context to context and country to country, as it should. So this group came together to really look at the scarcity of guidance, standards, and indicators, and think what we could do to bring a normative framework to this work and really strengthen the work across agencies and across sectors so that we could better measure the impact, efficacy of accelerated education as a way of really reaching some of the most marginalized children. So we'll go on to the next slide. Again, this is really a moment for all of us to reflect on education access and quality and who's accessing education, to ask ourselves tough questions about what's working and who it's working for. And so with this piece of work, we've really asked some questions about how accelerated education is becoming integrated into education systems and whether or not this is serving to reduce some of the institutional barriers to educational access, and ask questions about how these methods are specifically affecting girls and some other particularly marginalized populations. And so when we started the AEWG, we were very clear that we needed to specify what accelerated education meant when there's such a plethora of services that are out there, catch-up classes, alternative education. And what we really agreed and have released as definitions some years ago, but this is flexible, age-appropriate programming. And what we've really zoned in on is this is for disadvantaged, overage, out-of-school children and youth. So really to provide that opportunity to bring overage, out-of-school youth back into school, and understanding that the reasons that children are out of school are complex and compounding, and generally are driven by poverty, marginalization, and often conflict and crisis. And the goal is really to have these children integrated in meaningful, formal, recognized ways back into education. So looking at equivalency, looking at certification, and ensuring that the education provided really matches the cognitive maturity of children, that it's the kind of education that they need, and that teachers and learning approaches are well suited to meet those needs. We'll go on to the next slide, please. I just wanted to provide a little bit more background on some of the work that the AEWG has been doing to advance accelerated education, our understanding, and to build the evidence base. So as noted, the first piece of work was really to say what is accelerated education and to clarify those key definitions. And then we did a little bit more work on learners. Who are the learners that we're trying to reach? How should we decide whether and where AE is the right approach? And so we have the AE decision tree. And then we started looking at the elements and dimensions of quality accelerated education provision, and had developed 10 clear principles for effective practice. Then we decided to take those principles and expand them quite a bit, and to talk about how to implement them. It's bolstered with a number of case studies. And we've also been looking at measuring accelerated education in terms of effectiveness and outcomes. We have a pretty rigorous learning agenda and have just recently finalized and launched our monitoring and evaluation toolkit. These tools and guidance make up a sort of conceptual framework for accelerated education. And this is really meant, again, to create a normative framework in which we can operate so that we can say something collectively about what we're achieving. I just want to emphasize that all of these resources are available and hosted in INEE, and we really encourage you to explore them when you have time, to deepen your understanding about this issue, and also to continue to share with us your evidence and data around accelerated education. We'll move to the next slide. So again, this is just an opportunity for us to list out some of those practical tools that have been developed and to emphasize that these are available in English, French, Spanish, and Arabic. That we're developing some new guidance on teacher training that's currently being piloted, and we look forward to releasing that, as well as additional supplemental materials on workshop facilitation and other materials. So we are constantly developing guidance based on feedback we receive from our colleagues in the field who are working in accelerated education, and we're anticipating some more of these products to be ready at the end of the year. Move on to the next slide, please. We're also excited to share that we've recently completed a global mapping of accelerated education programs. This is hosted on the Humanitarian Development Exchange site. It has information on 169 accelerated education and other alternative education programs. Now, this covers 58 countries and over 81 implementing agencies, which I think speaks to the wide expanse of programming that we see. The map includes some information about donors, who the targeted beneficiaries are, and other program details that can help us understand how accelerated education is being implemented around the world. And we'll be looking to continuously update this. We'll move on to the next slide. So just building into Ritesh's presentation to give a bit more background on why it is that we're advancing this work, I wanted to give a brief overview of the Accelerated Education Working Group's 4 areas of focus. We revisit this every year for our work plan, but this has been the major pillars of our work. So again, we're trying to address some of these institutional and systemic barriers to children accessing education. And so we're looking at how accelerated education programs can be included by more governments in national education plans and policies. We've been fortunate to work a bit with Education Cannot Wait and some other donors on looking at ways that we can integrate this into education sector planning. This piece is related to our second pillar, which is around building the evidence base, strengthening the evidence base, again, to really understand what's working, where we're challenged, and where we need more data. We're looking at improving the quality of accelerated education programs, and that's through teaching, learning practices, it's through training, and through developing the guidance and standards that we think will contribute to harmonization and ensuring that we're really disseminating good practice. And then, of course, we'd like accelerated education to be better resourced by all key stakeholders so that we can take accelerated education to scale and ensure the necessary quality. In response to the COVID-19 pandemic, our group has been developing technical notes to support ministries and key stakeholders in deploying accelerated education. And this is something that Martha will be speaking more about because the need for accelerated education has been really a hot topic of discussion. How are we going to catch up all these children after months of being out of school, and how can we utilize that opportunity to bring previously out of school children back into the system? And we'll move on to the last slide of my presentation. So our goal around having the AE evidence base strengthened is building off those products that we've already talked a bit about, expanding our learning agenda, continuously updating the AE mapping, but we're also looking at new pieces of evidence to advance. So we want to continue to nurture existing research partnerships, but also grow new research partnerships. And so the piece that Ritesh is going to present is a really critical part of this, but just to give a teaser, we are looking at the next steps in our research already. We're continuously looking at areas where we need more data, better data, or a better analysis of existing data so that we can continuously inform our programmatic approaches. That's the last of my presentation. And again, we want to get on to the really interesting content that Ritesh is going to present, and then have ample time for a really rich discussion. So thank you all for letting me have the opportunity to open up the session and present a bit about the Accelerated Education Working Group. Really looking forward to hearing from the rest of our panelists. And with that, I'll hand over to Ritesh.
Thank you, Lisa. It's a pleasure to speak to all of you and to share a bit about the evidence review. I'm going to go through kind of the questions that the evidence review sought out to answer, a bit about the approach, and then really just delve into the findings. I'm going to do the same as Lisa and turn off my video again so that we can focus on the slides, we'll move through the slides quickly, hopefully, so that, again, we have time for questions at the end. If we can go to the next slide, please. So as Lisa already started to highlight, the evidence review was really focused on three main areas. And all of these areas are connected to the priorities of the AEWG at present time. The first is looking at the institutional level and basically how are AEPs part of the institutional framework within national government education strategic plans, and then some of the activities that flow from that. The second area of questioning was really around not just are AEPs providing access, but what are the outcomes of AEPs? What is the evidence we have in terms of learning? What is the evidence we have in terms of retention? And then what is the evidence we have on transition out of AEPs? And how might that differ based on different groups of learners who attend AEPs? The third stream of questioning was really looking more specifically at the question around gender transformative programming. Now, within that, we also did explore and look at gender sensitivity and gender responsiveness within AEPs and how that was being both acknowledged and then addressed in the programming itself. We can go to the next slide, please. So the way we went about collating and collecting the evidence was to start actually with the mapping exercise, which Lisa alluded to earlier. From that, one of the pieces of information that was collated in that mapping was a sense of which programs were in the midst of or had collected independent data about their program effectiveness and outcomes, largely in the form of either independent evaluations or other research reports. For the programs where this was indicated, we reached out to all of them, and we were able to obtain evidence from quite a number of them, as well as through Martha as the chair of the AEWG and other AEWG representatives. So you'll see that what we ended up with is a total of 26 different AEPs represented across quite a wide range of countries. And I do note that some of the programs and the program teams that contributed to this are on this call today. And I'd like to just actually acknowledge and thank them for being part of this evidence review. We can go on to the next slide. Just to also look at that span of countries and look at how does that map onto where's the prevalence of out-of-school children and youth most pronounced. And of course, this is pre-COVID-19 data, but what we had here is a snapshot from end of 2018. And we can see that if we look again at the countries where we have evidence from, they largely map onto the countries where we have the highest prevalence of out-of-school children and youth. There were some anomalies to the evidence that we were able to collect, largely actually from the Middle East, where we unfortunately did not have enough data on different programs to really look at that region in particular. But overall, we would say that most regions of the world were well represented in the evidence review that we conducted. Next, please. So I'm going to now move into the findings, and just to remind you again, the three kind of pillars of the evidence review were around the policy infrastructure around AEPs, the second around the outcomes of AEPs themselves, and the third then around gender. So on a positive note, one of the things that we found is that when we were looking at the countries where the AEPs within the evidence review were located, we found that in most instances, these countries mention and include AEPs explicitly within their national education strategic plans. Now, this piece of work was done actually prior to the current evidence review, where this analysis or the evidence behind this was collated in 2018. What we did is we went back and looked at that evidence a bit more closely and looked at how were AEPs mentioned. And what we found is that on a positive note, they're mentioned increasingly within education strategic plans. Next slide. One of the things, though, that we found when we dug a bit deeper is while AEPs might be mentioned, there are varying levels of engagement, ownership, and kind of oversight of AEPs when it comes down to actual implementation. In the case of the AEPs that we reviewed, approximately 50% of them, or exactly 50% of them, had some level of government involvement or oversight in what they were doing. Oftentimes this related to either issues of accreditation or of approval of the curriculum that was being used. But other than that, that meant that the AEPs were being run outside of direct government control and largely through the work of local or international NGOs. Around 30% of the AEPs were actually government-led. We found that there were some very large-scale AEPs in countries like the Philippines and El Salvador, where the government was really running the show on the AEPs themselves. And as I'll come to in a second, that makes a difference in terms of the scale and scope of learners that are able to be reached, and the kind of ongoing sustainability and commitment that national duty bearers have to AEPs. There were 20% of the programs, 5 of them to be exact, where we found that actually these AEPs continue to operate largely under the radar of government oversight and involvement. And this was slightly concerning given the fact that the AE principles make it very clear of the importance of ownership and engagement of national stakeholders in what is happening within AEPs. So while on the positive side, we can say that, you know, governments are increasingly involved in what's happening with AEPs, there are still some context where AEPs are really operating under the radar of government authorities. And there may be many different reasons for this, but in the long term, this does undermine the sustainability of these interventions. Next slide, please. So now let's look a bit deeper though. So beyond the inclusion of AEPs in education strategic plans, the question then becomes, how deep does that commitment run? And when we looked a bit deeper and actually looked at the narrative that was embedded in many of the evaluations that were written around AEPs, what we found is that many programs struggled with an institutional environment which they felt was still not fully supportive of their program. And there were many reasons for this. One is that in many contexts, AEPs are still pigeonholed under an emergency response, or conversely, they're placed firmly as a long-term developmental response. But there is still a lack of seeing AEPs sitting across the humanitarian development nexus, and the idea of how AEPs as a short-term strategy evolve into something that's enduring and long-lasting within systems where there is an intractable problem with high numbers of out-of-school children and youth. The second issue is in terms of commitments from national budgets and national education expenditure. And governments, rightly so, are focusing their efforts on supporting recurrent expenses in the formal education system, and AEPs oftentimes sit outside of that. What this means, however, is that in terms of financial sustainability, in terms of moving away from dependence of donors and external actors for the ongoing operating cost of such programs, we're still a long way away from that. And this can sometimes cause acute issues in terms of continuity within program cycles. Another significant issue is that at the moment, there is still a lack of integration of data on AE learners within EMIS systems. And where this becomes particularly problematic is when it comes to transition. So when these learners are not embedded within the EMIS system, it makes it very difficult to track what happens to these learners after they leave the AEP and move into, ideally, the formal education system. And so the fact that there isn't that system for data sharing and data warehousing within national systems is still a concern. And then linked to that is the broader question of those transition pathways more broadly. While on paper, many programs note that there is a commitment from national duty bearers to seeing learners from non-formal systems transition into the formal education systems. When it comes to what happens in practice, the story is oftentimes different. And oftentimes the barriers are small, insignificant, what seem like insignificant barriers, but can actually make all the difference in whether learners are able to enter into a formal school or not. Something as simple as having a record of learning or a report card that shows what learners achieved and having that report card recognized. In some programs, this was identified as a significant barrier to seeing learners transition into formal education. Next slide, please. So to summarize in terms of the policy context, then I think one of the key elements that this review highlights is the importance of that policy environment for what programs are able to achieve. And as we're going to now move to in terms of outcomes, I'll come back to this idea of how does the institutional environment impact on some of these outcomes that we're going to look at now. So the first thing that we looked at is, in terms of access, what are AEPs able to achieve and what are they not able to achieve? So on a positive note again, they are providing access to millions of disadvantaged out-of-school children and youth globally. But when we look at the overall picture and landscape of out-of-school children and youth, the actual percentage of learners they serve is still very small. Next slide, please. And this is just to give you a snapshot of that based on the numbers of beneficiaries that a sample of programs served, and the total number of out-of-school children and youth within that context. And we can see that in many cases, programs are serving relatively small percentages of that overall out-of-school children and youth. There were some anomalies to this though, and you'll see that the programs that were serving larger percentages of that population were oftentimes the ones that were government managed, operated, and run. Now, that's not to say that that's the perfect solution, however, because what we also saw was that these large-scale programs oftentimes achieve those numbers by kind of diffusing the model of engagement with learners. And what this meant was potentially using distance learning approaches, using home-based learning, which of course in the COVID-19 era, we're very familiar with. But in terms of actual efficacy of those efforts, these were the programs that also tended to suffer high rates of dropout, lower rates of learner achievement. So there is definitely a trade-off that I want to acknowledge between the reach of a program and then the quality and depth of that program. And finding that balance is, I think, still a challenge for many AEPs. Next slide, please. What the review also found was that there are still a number of inefficiencies when it comes to AEPs in terms of issues of high learner dropout, sometimes poor attendance rates. However, we then need to also acknowledge that we're talking about a group of disadvantaged learners out of school, who came from out of school, who were already likely to be those who are on the fringes of the formal education system. And even when we compare age comparable cohorts of data from within those national systems, we find that those rates may not be actually any worse and may in fact be better than the situation in the formal education system. Next slide, please. And this is just to give you a picture of a few programs and kind of the data for their survival rates. So in other words, how many of their learners made it to the end of the program or the end of the cycle, what percentage of the learners dropped out, and then how does that compare to, say, the dropout rate in primary education and survival rates in primary education. One thing to note, though, is that it was observed that there's a lot of inconsistencies at the moment in terms of how programs measure dropout, how they measure survival, how they measure advancement, and if they measure all of these indicators. Now, with the release of the new MEL monitoring and evaluation toolkit, potentially some more standardized guidance on how programs should be measuring this will help. But at the moment, there is a lot of variation in how these pieces of data are reported. Next slide. One thing that we did see is that AEPs are doing a much better job these days of reporting the outcomes in terms of learning, and specifically cognitive learning. Most programs are collecting data on cognitive learning in terms of basic numeracy and literacy skills. Fewer programs are looking at a wider range of learning outcomes beyond that, such as well-being and holistic development. And if we go to the next slide, you'll see that this is kind of just an indication of the types of data that are being collected. One thing that we observed is that increasingly a number of programs are using EGRA and EGMA to collect data on basic literacy and numeracy, and using that in oftentimes a comparative way to look at how that would look in relation to the formal education system. Now, one of the things I will highlight about that is I think there are some concerns or caveats that need to be made when making comparisons between the cognitive performance of overaged out-of-school learners who are learning in an accelerated fashion and those who are within the formal education system, or those who remain out of the education system overall. And there's more discussion around that in the evidence review itself, as well as also how this has been discussed explicitly by some of the evaluators who were looking at some of these programs and the ways that such comparisons were being made. There were also a number of programs that developed their own assessments. Oftentimes it was based on the national curriculum, and it was also used to support decisions around placement back into the formal education system. There were also a number of programs that used teacher or student self-report. Oftentimes this was in relation to non-cognitive outcomes in terms of academic self-efficacy, sense of well-being, a sense of wanting to remain in school, questions of that sort. There were, however, some programs that made assessments of whether or not learners had improved cognitively based on teacher or student self-report. And again, according to the guide to the principles, this is actually not sufficient to kind of understanding the actual outcomes for learners in and of themselves. Next, please. If we look at the last area, which is in terms of one, transition, and then secondly, in terms of the particularities of female learners, both issues continue to be kind of challenges for AEPs. And when we go to the next slide in a second, we'll talk a bit more about the transition, but just to suggest that what the evidence highlighted is that there is a consensus, it seems, that amongst the evidence reviewed, that generally speaking, for female learners, staying in the AEP till the end, completing the AEP and transitioning into formal education are all more difficult. And there is also evidence from a number of programs that suggest that in terms of learning outcomes, females tend to not perform as well as males, which is actually a somewhat different story than what we see in many formal education systems at the moment. So there's an interesting difference here happening with AEPs that I think needs to be further unpacked. If we go to the next slide now, if we talk specifically about transition barriers, you'll see that what we did was we tried to break down barriers into kind of supply side issues and demand side issues. Now, many of the both supply and demand side issues that are identified are ones that specifically impact on female learners in terms of opportunity, in terms of community and family support, in terms of safety and security. And so this is, again, where if we come back to that point around the policy context and the institutional environment, this is where programs themselves need to be kind of engaging and working at that policy level, or at least in partnership with formal schools and formal schooling systems at the local level to be considering some of these issues as part of the transition continuum. Next slide, please. The last area of the evidence review looked at the questions around gender and how gender was being considered and then responded to by the programs that we reviewed. Now, when a separate evidence review was done a few years ago, one of the perhaps more shocking findings was that at that time, most programs were actually employing a gender blind approach to their programming. What we found in this latest evidence review is that that narrative has shifted quite substantially. So most programs were very explicit in discussing how their programming recognized gender-specific barriers and how their programs were then designed to respond to them. Now, in most cases, the actions that were undertaken were either focused on gender-sensitive or gender-responsive type of actions, things such as employing more female teachers or ensuring there were gender segregated water and sanitation facilities. Where programs were a bit less focused was potentially on the gender transformative realm in terms of the changing of norms, behaviors, and attitudes towards gender. Where programs did engage with that, it was oftentimes around either trying to change teacher attitudes or community attitudes about what male or female learners were capable of and what possibilities they could enjoy or have afforded to them. However, even when programs did do this kind of work, they didn't oftentimes measure the outcomes of such efforts. And there were only two programs where we found that this was an explicit outcome of focus and where this was systematically measured. And again, you can read more about this in the evidence review itself, but if it's recognized increasingly that AEPs are focusing on addressing the needs of the most marginalized and thinking about what it takes to actually address those needs, then there's arguably a case to be made that gender transformative actions are a necessity, and that as part of that, it's important to understand whether programs are achieving gains in those areas. And measuring whether programs increased enrollments of females may not be sufficient to that task. Next slide. So in terms of where the evidence review leaves us off, it recommends that there's a strong need for AEPs to be working, as particularly implementers of AEPs, to be working in coordination with donors and national stakeholders to think about some of the gaps that I've described in terms of the policy implementation process. There's also a need for these policy advocacy efforts to be thinking about how to more fully integrate AEPs as a long-term response and to ensure appropriate and sufficient government ownership and oversight over this. Lastly, something that I think is not addressed as much as it needs to be or should be is to understand kind of the wider political economy in which commitments to non-formal education programs are made, and how that then influences the level of political will and capacity for seeing AEPs as a kind of long-term and enduring response. Next, please. One of the things that, in terms of outcomes, is that I would argue that we need to be careful as a community in making comparisons between outcomes of AEP learners and that of the formal education system. And there's two reasons for this. One, we might be comparing apples and oranges. That's the first reason. But two, there's a risk that by doing so, we perpetuate a narrative that is very commonplace in many communities and many systems, that non-formal or AEPs in particular are better than the formal education system. And there is a risk that this creates or reproduces a parallel education system, which may not be a sustainable or viable option in the long term. So this is why, again, there's a need to be thinking about system strengthening and alignment with the formal system. There's still a need to strengthen the evidence base on thinking on the contribution of AEPs beyond cognitive learning. I think what the SDGs have done is they've forced us to think about quality and learning more, but we've perhaps been pigeonholed into a fairly narrow conception of what quality learning is. And AEPs do a lot more for learners than just equip them with literacy and numeracy skills. And programs can be doing a better job at looking at those outcomes. A third area is that programs are doing a much better job of reporting around disaggregated information by gender, but there is still a real need to look beyond that at issues like household SES, the displacement status of learners, if that's relevant, and the disability status. And again, most programs did not report on and disaggregate outcomes at that level. And then lastly is to look at the gender transformative area and to think about what are programs that are doing this well, what are they doing and how are they doing it? What is the evidence they're gathering about this? And how could this be used as a catalyst to provide guidance for AEPs more broadly in this area? Next slide. Last slide is really to think about transition. And again, I think transition is probably one of the most challenging areas for AEPs moving forward. So I think one of the things is that we need to understand what helps and aids transition. Where is it that AEPs are able to effectively ensure that learners transition and remain in, say, formal education, if that's the pathway that they're going into? What is it that these programs are doing with local schools or the formal education system to ensure, or communities to ensure that happens? The second is that we need to also look beyond the transition to formal education. We need to recognize that AEPs sometimes are not necessarily focused solely on that transition to formal education, but maybe about transition into technical vocational education, paid employment, or other livelihood opportunities. And again, there's a need to look at what are the outcomes around that a bit more explicitly. So these were the kind of main findings from the evidence review, and I believe that alongside this webinar is the launch of the actual evidence review, and many of the examples and programs where there's further explanation of some of these findings is provided there. But of course, I'm happy to answer some questions at the end of the webinar as well. Thank you. And I think I'm handing on to Pete.
Yes, I think so. Thanks very much for that, Ritesh. So I'm just going to spend a few minutes talking about a slightly broader lens of how accelerated education supports what we might call alternative education, which is, in essence, I'm just going to put a timer on here, a slightly bigger picture of non-formal education. Non-formal is also a word that we struggled with a little bit, and I'll go into exactly who the group is around develop this information and so forth. But non-formal is obviously presented as being in contrast to formal, and those are a useful dichotomy, but not always a clear one, and not always something that captures everything that's going on in terms of education activities in crisis type context. So with that kind of background, we and under the auspices, actually, can we go to the next slide? Under the auspices of the Education Policy Working Group in INEE, we developed a work stream on alternative education with the intention of looking at this in a little bit more detail, learning a lot from what was developed under the Accelerated Education Working Group about what they've done around definitions and investigations, and obviously now the research around what is happening around accelerated education. And the initial aim was to try and come up with a taxonomy, a sort of a set of definitions around what we mean by these various other additional areas of non-formal education, and as we call it, alternative education. And a big part of this was done by several people under the alternative education work stream, and also Kayla, who's on this group as well, who's on this panel. Some of the overall background to that was the attempt to have a landscape review of what was happening over these very, very varied types of models and types of interventions that were happening across a wide range of different crisis contexts, with the kind of ones that we discuss in INEE, that are also relevant sometimes for the accelerated education context as well, but particularly for ones with maybe slightly higher age groups of young people who may not be able to transition or return back into education, where it may not be relevant for them to do so. Under that, there was this table that's on here that was developed that to give this clarity, distinction, to categorize a little bit in different areas. Formal education, as we understand it, at the top, and then this broader package of non-formal areas around transitional programming, alternative education, and then we still add another category of other non-formal education. So there's quite a few different brackets there, because there's obviously such a spectrum, let's say, of different types of programming. And it was an attempt to try and capture some of these in different ways, try and learn from them, to then carry us forward and try to improve those different areas and where the gaps were. And that's what I'll talk about in a minute. There's also support services that run alongside all of these kind of areas. I mean, some examples of the kind of thing we might include in those different categories. When it comes to the middle one around alternative education, that would include, for example, accelerated education, much as the ones that have been talked about earlier. Also alternative basic education, maybe for higher age groups, and then second chance programs, and also things like youth livelihoods training and so forth. Other non-formal education might include, for example, short-term programming, specific skills programming around maybe computer skills and so forth, or other TVET type skills as well that could fit into there. The transitional programs that particularly then connect between those other forms of alternative back into the formal education might be then something like catch-up programs, bridging programs that have a specific focus on some language, for example. So not the scale of the larger accelerated educations, but these small interventions around transition. Support services, and then the broader package that might kind of go with that. That might then be tutoring, it might be remedial education, dropout prevention, learning readiness, campaigning, and so forth, or like that. And then also the wider components that are often brought into these kind of programs around social emotional learning, social support, peace education, life skills, health understanding, health awareness, and these kind of things. So the aim of the alternative education workstream was to try and create this understanding, this taxonomy of how all of these programs might fit together, and accelerated education being one that we know of and that's very well understood and increasingly well researched, fits into alternative education. But we're going to then sort of open that out and see what do we know from that can tell us about these other forms of programs. On the next slide. So what we did under the alternative education workstream was to, in essence, try and learn from what had been done through accelerated education, because we felt that that was one of the areas of non-formal education that was most well defined. For several years now, under the Education Working Group, they've created the definitions, the structures, now things like the monitoring evaluation frameworks, and then different level of research. So it really strengthens the evidence base for what's done, and then programming can improve from it. And things like Ritesh was talking about being incorporated into national education sector plans, for example, things like that, or greater funding provided for it comes from that. So this was an attempt to begin the process of doing something similar to that for alternative education. What was developed after that taxonomy of the definitions of what we were trying to talk about under alternative education was then these considerations, the 10 considerations that were created around what we would say for non-formal education for adolescents in youth and crisis conflicts. They're not recommendations as such, they're just considerations, because again, we're still at the relatively early stage of trying to determine what we mean, how we can capture this wider spectrum together of non-formal education. And I'm going to run through a few of those considerations in relation to what Ritesh has identified from the research, to sort of give some relevance for that and what we can learn from research for this ongoing agenda around alternative education. I put the first consideration on here is kind of across the board, I think, and does relate to a lot of what we do and what a lot of other people would do in terms of provision of education in non-formal settings or crisis settings, and that's ensuring the availability of safe, inclusive education options, including funding, provision, non-formal education. In here it says especially at the post-primary level, because we know that a lot is and has been focused at the primary level. We know that a lot of accelerated education does tend to focus on that primary level as well, if not the primary age group. And we were interested in the slightly the challenges that come after that point, and the people who don't necessarily fit into there, and the fluidity of people as they move in and out of that category. So on the next slide, so the first area that Ritesh talks about was the policy context for AEPs, and some of the key points that he mentioned are at the top there, that AEPs increasingly are acknowledged within national education sector plans, sometimes with including funding, but not possibly as much as might be. But there were still significant gaps around policy level commitments, the government ownership, the financial allocations still largely delivered through NGOs, for example, and then integration into EMIS, so that the people are counted, so that the evidence evidence aware, and that can lead on to more policy change and more funding. And then those transition pathways as well, a vital component of it. And they were all quite relevant for some of these particular areas that we picked out for the wider spectrum of alternative education. So, for example, on number 2, it was about these are considerations that we've identified. The implementers, donors, and stakeholders should ensure a supportive legal and policy environment for displaced adolescents and youth, including broadening the capacity of national governments to take ownership of education programs. So, still that sense that the overall, I guess, direction of travel would be to have anything that's non-formal ultimately incorporated into national systems. That's a big lift, that's a big ask as well. We know that that takes a huge amount of time, but I think what we've learned from how it's happened under accelerated education is the way that this might work for other forms of non-formal education as well. The next one was around ensuring equivalency and certification, so adolescents and youth affected by crisis can continue school, develop productive livelihoods. So that kind of comes under the regulation, I suppose, and a lot of this is to do with regulation, which is at the crux, I think, of a huge amount of alternative education programming. That the challenge of the accreditation, the certification, the equivalency, how that supports transition into formal program or into other stages of non-formal education is a bit of a minefield, and it's very, very difficult to provide for the government necessarily to take on the full responsibility for that in the type of context that we're referring to in crisis context. They are by definition ones where state supply, state services and so forth are going to be eroded or possibly removed, or there may be a question of their legitimacy. So the regulation, I think, is vital, and it runs throughout all of this. But some of what we're looking at in the alternative stream is, what do you do despite that? If you can't have that kind of regulation, if you can't have necessarily the policy direction or the funding certainly coming from a centralized government source or something like that, what other options are available? The last one of these considerations we had was around supporting transition to further schooling or livelihoods opportunities for out-of-school adolescents and youth in conflict and crisis. So again, that sense of moving a pathway of learning, that they wouldn't be single one-off programs at any point of whatever length, but there is this sense that they move forward. And I think that kind of goes again throughout with what was identified in the accelerated education evidence, and also what we know from the field, that people want possibly not just one-off examples of opportunities to access learning, but that it feeds into something a little bit longer. On the next slide was the outcomes of AEP. So this was some of the things that were identified around, again, particularly the small percentage that actually accelerated education, or that any of these programs might individually be able to identify. And it's only maybe en masse, or when sort of brought all together, that they can have this much more sizable impact. The struggle with transition that has, this was a key one for us. The technical vocational education or livelihoods for AE learners was not, or rarely was, an explicit focus or function of a lot of AEP programs. And then also that female learners have particular challenges around retention, completion, transition. The second one around technical vocation, I think, is key to this. That hasn't been, and I would agree with Ritesh from my experience, that much of a focus around accelerated education. And I think partly because of the nature and the desire to codify what accelerated education is, and it's and to give it that strength, give it that consistency, give it that quality and integrity of what it does, it sometimes then maybe might lose the relevance of the broader labour market of providing those additional skills, especially to the slightly older age groups who might not necessarily want to have a catch-up program or a bridging program or accelerated program for the lower levels of primary. So, for example, we have in number 4, ensure relevance of non-formal education to the appropriate country's education system and their labour market. And the labour market was the part that I think came out quite strongly in our background paper. I should have noted this at the start. There's the two documents that were developed under alternative education workstream under INEE, with the taxonomy and background landscape review, and then this considerations paper, and they're going to be released very soon as well, and all of this information is in there. So this will hopefully jumpstart this conversation much more so. I'll move on a bit quickly because I don't have a huge amount of time. So on the next slide, this was then the next part around changing gender norms, and I think this was quite significant, just as Ritesh was saying, that a few years ago, even when reviewing accelerated education programming, there wasn't necessarily the sense that there was a clear line of sight on the implications for gender. or even that they were gender blind, let alone sort of, let's say, responsive or transformative in what they were doing, and that's shifting, that there is much more recognition of that. And then that's a fantastic movement forward. That, I think, is something relevant for alternative education that there hasn't been, I would say, certainly from this initial finding. That's equally that sense that there's a clear understanding of the implications for gender. There's an awareness of the challenges are there, that there's an intersection between the issues related to gender and accessing these points of education, but what people are doing about it, how they might, for example, integrate different teaching and learning practices or community, or pulling on and shifting and changing community perceptions and beliefs around accessing these wider forms of non-formal education and alternative education is less clear. I'm sure it is happening in many senses, but it was difficult to pull that out in any kind of consistency. So that's clearly something that needs to be and can be pushed a little bit further. Taking maybe gender on a slightly broader sense around other forms of equity or other forms of need related to the children beyond their, let's say, their specific learning needs. There's a few points that were relevant, I think, around, for example, implementing holistic programming. This is some of the considerations from our paper. Implementing holistic programming, including, for example, WASH, protection, health measures. Obviously, a lot of that will have to do with gender barriers as well. And then livelihoods, and then also peace building, a whole additional category, I suppose, that is very relevant and can be incorporated into any of these alternative models. There was the next one, and I did put, the research did find that, that certain AEPs may contribute to the well-being and holistic development of out-of-school children and youth. It was just that it was difficult to know, it was difficult to capture that and to show the impact. So again, this was a key part for any of these broader alternative models, that they meet crisis and conflict affecting young children's needs for psychosocial support, social emotional learning and trauma recovery, and that many of these programs may even focus on that explicitly as being their entry point for educational needs. And then the last one is around engaging out of school adolescent youths affected by crisis and conflict. So there's a bit more of a participatory process about how this might take place, and including the needs of the children themselves, the voice of the children and the communities. Just on the one more slide, just a couple of final points on the commonality between accelerated education and wider alternative education. There's a lot of crossover, there's a lot of similarities, and we can learn a huge amount from the process, as I was saying before, that's been taken on accelerated education, leading to the point now where we have very concrete evidence of the work that they're doing, the consistency and the gaps that they have, and how that can be filled from various directions, from programming, from a policy direction, and so forth. So many of those recommendations are quite key for us. The evidence paper shows the next steps for non-formal education, and that's what we're going to be pursuing next once we publish these two papers, this taxonomy and this considerations paper. And that the fun about the education landscape may become more varied. There are going to be possibly more actors, maybe non-staters delivering this kind of work, different sources of finances coming up, different demands, different relevance for the work, more demand for that education and the non-formal education to speak to the labour markets in question. And that means there might be an increased, not a reduced need for alternative models. We all want to pursue quality, and sometimes that quality is assumed a comprehensive model, something that's consistent, and we often move towards that, and that's not necessarily always the way we have to do it. So I think that hopefully this alternative education approach identifies the plethora of work that is being done that's high quality and it's legitimate and recognized. It's just maybe that understanding of the regulation around it that's limited. And then we're hoping that COVID-19 may inform a lot of this. There's a huge amount of demand for alternative models. I haven't talked about anything to do with digital models and distance models. That would be a mechanism through which a lot of this could or should be delivered, and I'm sure we're going to learn a lot from that as well. So yeah, I'll stop there, and I think we'll move on to a bit of discussion about how all this might fit together.
So, hi everyone, this is Martha Hewson. I'm chair of the Accelerated Education Working Group, and we're just going to very, very briefly look at the implications of the evidence review that Ritesh has just gone through for the AEWG work. If you can just move to the next slide, please. So just to say really, that the Accelerated Education Working Group believes that the efforts in developing and disseminating the tools and guidance alongside their utilization have really supported the harmonization of accelerated education programs globally, and particularly use of the 10 principles have improved both the quality and legitimacy of accelerated education programs. But over the years, we've also noticed that there's significant barriers that accelerated education programs face when working towards some of the 10 principles in the absence of any supportive policy environment. And in 2016, so also this was some time back, but we did some case studies about how accelerated education programs are aligned with the 10 principles. And it was found that many implementing partners often encountered local, regional, or national policy contexts which were yet to fully recognize, understand, or make strong commitments towards the role and function of non-formal education in general, and especially accelerated education. So over the last 2 years, really, the Accelerated Education Working Group have begun to engage more directly with national policy makers and key donors who have the potential to shape the structural conditions with which AEPs operate. So we've done a lot of national level workshops, and we've really tried to engage more directly with policy. If you can go to the next slide, please. I think the arrows got a bit wonky when this was uploaded, but Lisa already presented this, and I just wanted to focus on it very briefly again, that in the most recent Accelerated Education Working Group meeting, which was in March 2020, we really made a decision for the group to shift its efforts towards engaging more explicitly with national governments to promote and support quality accelerated education provision, but through increased attention to policy, as well as targeting key stakeholders to better resource accelerated education. So as I said, we already had a focus on this in the last couple of years, but in the meeting in 2020, we really made a big push to really change our efforts. And then this new direction for the AEWG has been validated through the findings of the evidence review that Ritesh has presented. And we've seen that what he presented, the evidence review really strongly signals that the need for the AE community should engage more strategically and systematically with national policymakers and the formal education system. And it also recommended that we engage in more research and analysis of the wider political economy in which national commitments to both non-formal education and accelerated education programs are made, and look at how it influences national and local level will and capacity, because really what we want to see is accelerated education meaningfully embedded into the education systems of countries with high numbers of out-of-school children and youth. So you can really see that we have our 4 areas of focus. And if you can go to the next slide, just quickly to look at those areas of focus. We have our areas of focus by more governments in accelerated education, included by more governments in national education plans and policies. And here we want the Accelerated Education Working Group really envisions that more governments will recognize accelerated education as a cost-effective, inclusive, and equitable response for overage, out-of-school children and youth. So we'll continue to facilitate national level workshops, which I mentioned we've been doing, and also collaborating with governments. But we also really want to develop an investment case and a policy case where we'll focus on identifying the scope of the problem regarding out-of-school children and youth, and try and articulate ways in which national governments can take a lead in regulating non-formal education provision. You can go to the next slide, please. The other area of focus that I wanted to look at is looking at how accelerated education programs can be better resourced by key stakeholders for scale and quality. So also in 2020-21, we've decided to try and target and work with key stakeholders to promote and advocate for the inclusion of accelerated education within donor approaches and programmatic responses by fostering the recognition of accelerated education as an important strategy for connecting humanitarian, early recovery and development programming. And these are some of the donors and partners that we've decided to specifically engage in and to try and work with in 2021. And ECHO have already included the AEWG tools and guidance in their EIE policy document. So already we're seeing the fruits of our engagement. And then the last slide before we get into discussion, because I can see a lot of questions coming up, is just a very brief mention of the upcoming work of the Accelerated Education Working Group in relation to COVID. These are all in process as I speak, but we're trying to work on a response to COVID brief and trying to work on an adaptation of the AEWG decision tree to really look at the importance and reinforcing the accelerated education program definitions. Because if we look at the definitions, they're likely the target of most of the responses in response to COVID is that the children that have already been in school and have missed out on education because of the COVID pandemic, mostly catch-up programs. They've missed out on short amounts of education, but they were in school before. And then, of course, we have to look at those who are in accelerated education programs, remembering that these are the most marginalized and out of school children and youth, and the importance of supporting these learners to make sure that they actually get back into education, because they're very likely not to return. So a lot of attention needs to be paid to back to school campaigns, support to stay in school, advocacy with donors to extend funding or adapt programs accordingly. And then we were noticing when we were looking at the proliferation of catch-up programs that there's very little guidance on condensing a curriculum. You know, how do ministries of education or teachers condense a curriculum in response to students having missed out on, you know, a term, 6 months of schooling? So we're also working on the third one down, considerations for practitioners. So guidance, very basic guidance on condensing a curriculum. And then the last one we're going to work on is the core principles to condense a curriculum, which is specifically for accelerated education. And we hope to have the most of those out in the next couple of months. So thank you very much. I'll just hand over back to Lisa and apologize for the barking of the dogs.
Thank you so much, Martha. So I hope that everyone can appreciate how much work is being done in this space and how committed all of the Accelerated Education Working Group members are. So we've been tracking your questions in the chat function. Thank you all so much for your engagement. It looks like we have a number of questions coming up. So I'm actually going to hand over to Kayla, who's going to be moderating our discussion and ensuring we can get to as many questions that you shared as we can in the time that remains. Kayla, over to you.
Great, thanks, Lisa. And first of all, I just want to say thank you so much to all of our presenters and for the audience for being here today. If you would like to join on video presenters, please go ahead and do so we can see you while you're speaking. And for the audience members, if you want to switch to gallery view, you'll be able to see folks a little bit better. I also want to let a lot of folks know, because a lot of questions have been coming in the Q&A box. So if you, and a lot of them are being rapidly responded to by our participants. And if you want to see those responses that have already come through, please just click on the Q&A box at the bottom and click answered. So I won't be able to run through each of the questions that have been sent. So please do take a look if there's something that you're interested in the Q&A box. Lisa started us off with a wonderful framing of some of the work that's been done by the AEWG, and Martha sort of took us forward for what has been done or what will be done, particularly in the COVID response by the AEWG. And Pete also framed the evidence review in the broader framework of alternative education that INEE's alternative education work stream has been looking at. So several questions for Ritesh have come up around the evidence review. And I think it's really helpful to think about those questions and think about the evidence review within those broader frames of accelerated education, alternative education, and now in the COVID response. I want to address one question very quickly myself. So early on, a question came out asking, are these AEPs currently in operation? And having been involved with the mapping that this evidence review began with, those AEPs that were surveyed were currently in operation at the time of the survey, which was in 2019. So those that are no longer operating are really recently operating. I understand that the evidence review built on that mapping and then also potentially found other AEPs. So Ritesh, feel free to jump in if that is not correct, but my understanding is really that they are very, very recent, if not currently operating. And I got the thumbs up for that. Good. So that's just a helpful background information. A couple of questions came in regarding methodology and thinking about, not methodology necessarily for the evidence review, but around methodology of, exploring some of these important research questions regarding AEP. I'm going to give a couple of them to you at the same time, Ritesh, and you can answer them as you see fit. So one question came in from Ash Hartwell, which said, in drawing overall generalizations of AEP effectiveness, do not find a wide range of outcomes and that it will depend on resource management and capacity. And shouldn't this be highlighted as a way to establish better practice? So that's looking at research management and capacity and best practice in collecting evidence. Kamal also asked a question about, are the evaluation tools for AEP the same as ordinary education evaluation tools? And finally, Joshua asked us to elaborate a little bit more on the traps of comparing test outcomes for AE students to conventional classroom students. So Ritesh, let me know if you need me to elaborate anything else.
Okay, great. I'll start with the last one because it's probably not a straightforward response, and I'm not trying to argue that we shouldn't do it at all, but I think we need to be aware of the challenges and the pitfalls of making such comparisons. For one, we need to recognize that who are we comparing to? So for example, if we're comparing a group of 11 to 18-year-old students who are sitting grade 1, 2, and 3 of formal school, are we comparing them to students who in the formal school are ages 6, 7, and 8, who would be in the same grades? And is that a relevant comparison, given the fact that part of accelerated education theory is the fact that brain development and cognitive learning can happen differently as you mature. So if we're going to be thinking about then how does that then translate into the realm of comparability and assessment? Is a better counterfactual students of that same age who are out of school? But the question then is, where do you find them? How do you test them? So I'm not, I guess I recognize the challenges that programs face and the need to have counterfactuals, but to say that we need to be mindful of what are the counterfactual arguments we're making and what are the implications of that. And I think, again, the other thing, and I noticed there was a comment that was raised somewhere, is that, the other risk is that AEPs become seen as the better quality option to the formal school. And when programs promote a message that we're doing better than the formal school, there's a risk that reproduces that messaging. And that may not be the messaging that programs want to promote in the long term. In relation to the question on the wide range of outcomes and the resource management and capacity to capture all those outcomes, I think Ash is absolutely right. I think there's higher and higher demands for the production of evidence, but not necessarily the concomitant resourcing to enable that. And so programs do what they can. And I think this then relates to the other question is around the tools and what tools are being used. So I think what happens is that when it comes to looking at cognitive learning and particularly benchmarking learners against a national curriculum, those are usually AEP specific tools. But when we're looking at other measures of kind of well-being, or looking at just basic literacy and numeracy skills, as I indicated, a lot of programs are using EGMA and EGRA, which are kind of standardized tools, open source tools that programs are probably using, not just for the AEP, but for other education programming, and maybe not just in that country. So I think it's a mixture, and I think what we're seeing is that there's tools that are being brought in from other education programs that aren't AEPs to look at some of those outcomes. But when we look at accreditation of learning, those are typically AEP specific tools because of the need for recognition of learning.
Great, thanks, Ritesh. The second question or set of questions is somewhat tied into what Martha was starting to present about, which is the COVID education response. So I'll first direct this question to Ritesh and then open it up to the larger group if others want to engage. It's sort of a thought exercise. So Navraj commented, as our accelerated learning program needs to be in line with the government's academic calendar, now we're not able to conduct this due to COVID, but the time frame of course is already condensed and might be harder to graduate them with good learning achievements. Could you suggest any idea to run these AEP classes from a distance or minimizing the COVID transition response? And just to broaden that out, because there was a couple other comments on the COVID response, I guess my question to you, Ritesh, to add on to that would be, what does the evidence review tell us about that might be useful for the COVID response a bit more broadly? So over to Ritesh, and then if others want to add in.
So I guess in terms of transitioning AEP delivery to distance, I think one of the things that was found, and this could be historical, and maybe we've learned a lot in this current COVID period around distance learning. But unfortunately, when AEPs relied on distance learning or have relied on AEP distance learning in the past, some of the key things that enable AEPs to ensure retention, learning, and attendance and participation are lost. For example, the student-teacher relationship, the ability for the teacher to check in on what's happening with the student on a daily basis, to be able to cater and differentiate instruction. Some of these opportunities can be lost, and I think, so we need to think a bit more around distance learning pedagogy and how that translates specifically into the accelerated learning space. And this is, I think, a relatively new area for all of us. In terms of what do we learn about accelerated education programming and its successes and challenges more broadly for COVID-19, I guess it depends on, I mean, I think we need to be careful because, and this is, I think, where it comes back to the definition. We need to be careful that, at least at the moment, there is a segment of the population for which accelerated education programs moving forward will be relevant, but there will be large segments where a catch-up or a bridging type model is going to be more relevant, because we're talking about learners, you know, large groups of learners who have lost you know, chunks of learning, but these are learners who are likely to go back into formal education. But we have another group of learners who were already at risk of dropping out, who are likely to have permanently dropped out and may not return to formal education. And it's this group of learners that we should be thinking about accelerated education responses moving forward, and how to engage them now and how to identify them now.
Great, thanks, Ritesh. Did anybody have anything else to add on the COVID response and AEP? And in the interest of time, I'll try and get to our last Couple of questions. I'm going to clump a couple of things together again. This one focusing a bit on equity. So your last research question looked specifically at gender transformativity, but also a lot of questions were raised about children with disabilities in AEP, which I wanted to raise. And another question was raised about mother tongue education, so potentially minority, religious, and ethnic groups. So one of the questions says, Professor Shah, were children with disabilities considered in the marginalized children? If yes, can you let us know more about the findings? And another question related to mother tongue was, does the analysis show that AEP programs are transacted in the mother tongue of children or in the standard language of transaction in schools? And what do you think, based on the evidence, about the need to sensitize the medium of instruction in the mother tongue?
Great. Yes, I started to respond to a couple of those questions around students with disabilities in the response to the questions, but I just wanted to highlight the fact that what we found is that while the evaluations we looked at oftentimes talked about maybe responses of programs to either encourage students from disabilities to be enrolled in AEPs or to remain in AEPs. When it came to looking at outcomes for this group of learners, they were noticeably silent. Now, oftentimes it's because the number of learners that these programs are serving with identified disabilities is relatively small. So to be able to do any kind of robust comparison is quite difficult. However, I do think that potentially disability might be the new blind spot with AEPs. In the same way that I discussed gender a few years ago as being the blind spot, I think disability is clearly a blind spot within AEPs at the moment, and likely something that needs to be addressed. With mother tongue instruction, this is an interesting one. So programs that seem to have a lot of success in getting community engagement and kind of learner retention tended to employ the use of mother tongue. However, and this again goes back to the institutional environment, there is a challenge here, which is that when national curriculums are structured in a single language of instruction, and when end of program assessments are in that language, there's oftentimes a pressure for programs to then teach to that language of instruction to ensure that learners can transition. So this is again one of those questions of what can the formal education system potentially learn from AEPs and how they cater to the needs of marginalized groups, and you know, how can that learning influence the way that the system as a whole responds?
Great, thanks so much, Ritesh. Noticing the time, I want to say thank you very much to all of the panelists, and I want to turn it back over to Margie, who I believe will be doing our final closing.
Thank you. Thanks, Kayla. And thanks to all of our panelists for quite a rich discussion. As you can see in the Q&A and the chat, it's been a very engaging conversation and just the beginning for all of us working in this space. So please look out for future webinars related to accelerated education and alternative education from both the Accelerated Education Working Group and the Alternative Education Workstream within INEE. Some great resources that are coming up as well, as Pete mentioned, from the INEE workstream around a background paper and a taxonomy project that we've been engaged in. You can find all of this information as well as the recording for this webinar and the presentation slides on the INEE website. If you registered for this webinar, you'll also get an email with the presentation links. There were lots of questions that we did not get to, so we will answer those offline and add slides with your answers to the end of the presentation so they can be answered and everyone can review those. Thank you once again to our great panelists. It's been a wonderful discussion, and thank you for our very engaged participants. Wishing you all a great rest of the week and have a great evening. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.